Good afternoon. My name is Ketra Rice and I'm a PhD student in the John Glenn School of Public Affairs, and today I will be doing a refresher course on microeconomic theory. So for today's class, I'll start with an introduction followed by a few pointers on the role of the market, followed by marginal analysis, consumer theory, the law of demand, and finally I'll go back to consumer theory and do an example regarding consumer surplus. All economic problems and questions arise because human wants exceed human demand. So basically, there aren't enough resources available to satisfy every want that we have as human beings in a particular society, and this condition is called scarcity. So in essence, all economic problems arise because there's scarcity. And so today we're going to talk about how we can use economic theory to actually decide what resources we want to produce, how we want to produce them, when we want to produce them, and for whom we want to produce them. Because as stated before, we basically don't have enough of the resources available to satisfy all of the wants that humans in our society actually have. With an understanding of economic theory, we have the ability to explain, predict, and control the economy if possible. Economics can be classified into a number of divisions. In economic philosophy, we talk about positive and normative economics, which you'll hear a lot as you enter into Public Affairs 830 in the fall quarter. And we also have the major fields of micro and macroeconomics, and microeconomics is what we're discussing today. But just to give you a brief history of those two economic philosophies in those two major fields, positive economics is concerned with what is, was, or will be. It considers the actual conditions that have occurred in the economy, and if two people disagree over anything in positive economics, you can actually use some type of statistics to test what they're discussing. For example, if I were to say a 10% increase in the price of gasoline will have no effect on the number of vacationers going skiing, this is a positive statement because we can actually test this using some type of research. We could look at the number of skiers before the price hike and compare that to the number of skiers after the price hike. This is positive economics. Normative economics is concerned with what ought to be. These are value statements or judgments that we make. For example, if two people disagree over a normative statement such as healthcare reform should include a government-sponsored healthcare plan, this is a positive statement because this is a value statement and there's no type of statistics or empirical evidence that you can actually conduct that will destroy one's belief about the issue because this is inherently what they believe. And so as you approach Public Affairs 830, you'll begin to talk about positive and normative economics and the types of tools that you would use or the types of arguments or different techniques that you would use to debate or try to understand both of those issues. Now, we have the two major fields of economics, micro and macro. Macro is concerned with the behavior of the total economy, and it includes such things as the total volume of output for a nation, the total level of income and expenditures, whereas microeconomics is concerned mainly with the economic activities of individuals, individual consumers, individual producers, or groups of consumers and producers known as the market. For example, we will be using microeconomics to discuss the consumer's demand for any type of product, food, clothing. We would also use microeconomics to look at the cost of a firm for production of any type of output. And we would also use microeconomics to look at the per unit price of a firm, for example, for a specific volume of outputs that they produce. So the course that you'll be taking in the fall basically deals with microeconomic theory. And I'll go ahead and begin introducing you to a few major concepts in microeconomic theory. Now, the market is the place where buyers and sellers interact to determine the price of a product or a set of products. And you'll hear terms such as a perfectly competitive market and an imperfectly competitive market in your course. Perfectly competitive markets are defined by at least 6 criteria. They're defined by many buyers and many sellers in the marketplace. So there are basically many consumers with the willingness and ability to buy the product at a certain price, and there are many producers with the willingness and ability to supply the product at a certain price. 2, perfectly competitive markets are defined by low entry and exit barriers, which means it's relatively easy to enter or exit the market as a business. 3, Perfectly competitive markets are defined by perfect information, which means prices are assumed to be known by all consumers and producers. 4, perfectly competitive markets are defined by transactions that are costless, which means that buyers and sellers incur no cost in making any type of market exchange, which means there's no cost to the information associated with that particular type of market exchange. 5, firms aim to maximize their profits. This just means that firms aim to sell where their marginal costs meet their marginal revenue, where they generate the most profit. And later on in this particular session, I'll talk about marginal analysis in more detail. And 6, the characteristics of any given market good or service do not vary across suppliers. So if there are 3 suppliers selling TVs, the type of TV doesn't particularly vary across these different suppliers. So these are the things you have to remember regarding perfectly competitive markets. Now, competitive markets establish one price. This is the market price, and this market price is basically an efficient way to ration scarce resources. We talked about scarcity earlier, meaning that there are unlimited wants in a society and there's not enough goods or services or demand to meet those wants. So basically the market price is an efficient way to sort of ration scarce resources, and so at market equilibrium, all buyers and sellers are satisfied with their quantities at that market price. And now I'll do an example of market equilibrium. So in market equilibrium, equilibrium in supply and demand occurs where your quantity supplied equals your quantity demanded. And in each of the problem sets that you'll be faced with in your class, you'll have a supply curve and a demand curve, which will be given to you, and it will be written as quantity supplied equals some number and quantity demand equals some number or some equation for each. And what you have to do to get the market equilibrium is set these two equations equal to each other and solve for the unknown variable. And we typically solve for price as the unknown variable, and then we put the value of price back into either equation to get the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded. So for example, we have quantity supplied equals -5 plus 3p. Quantity demanded equals 10 minus 2p. So we're going to set these equations equal to each other. Okay, so quantity supplied equals quantity demanded, so -5 plus 3p equals 10 minus 2p. So what we're doing, we're going to try and solve for price, which is p in this equation. So what we can do is add 2p to each side to isolate these p's and put them on the same side of the equation. So now we have -5 plus 5p equals 10. So now we just have to isolate price, p, and have that on one side of the equation by itself. So we have 5p equals 10, and we're adding a 5 to both sides of the equation. So 5p equals 10 plus 5, 5p equals 15, p equals 15 divided by 5, which is 3. So when we set our supply and demand equations equal to each other, we have an equilibrium price of $3. And because we're talking about market equilibrium, this price is the same price for the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded. So we can pick one of these equations to put the value of price back in to get the quantity, and this quantity will be the same quantity demanded as the same quantity supplied, because we're talking about an equilibrium condition where these things are equal. So if we substitute a price of 3 into the quantity demanded equation, okay, we have our quantity demanded equals 10 minus 2 times p, which is $3. So our quantity demanded is equal to 10 minus 6, which is 4 quantity, or units of quantity. In the role of the market, we're looking at how we have market equilibrium that establishes the price and the quantity that consumers and producers are basically satisfied with for the purchase and exchange of products and services. Now, keep in mind that when we talk about consumers and producers, we're assuming that there's rational choice. Consumers are making rational choices by comparing all of the costs and benefits available to them and choosing the optimal allocation. And we're also assuming that there is a benefit that they gain or some type of pleasure that they gain from purchasing these products. And so this brings us to the next point, which is marginal analysis. So marginal analysis is a key concept in macroeconomic theory. Marginal analysis is made by comparing all the relative alternatives systematically and incrementally, and it is an acknowledgement that people make a decision based on the incremental gains and losses that result from that decision. For example, if you own a business and wonder whether you should stay open until 10 rather than closing at 8, your focus is on the benefits and costs of staying open the additional 2 hours. So key concepts in marginal analysis, again, are marginal cost, which is the cost of an additional unit increase in an activity, or a 1 unit increase in an activity if we're looking at 1 unit increments. Marginal benefits would be what you gain when you get 1 more unit of something. Marginal utility, which is the additional utility gain from a consumer consuming 1 more unit of a good. And you'll hear the term utility throughout macroeconomics. This just simply means satisfaction. So it's the additional satisfaction that a consumer would gain from consuming 1 more unit of a good. And lastly, you have marginal rate of substitution, which you'll get into more as I talk about consumer theory, which looks at the what a person is willing to give up in exchange for 1 more unit of another commodity. So what I'm about to do is an example of how you can calculate marginal cost. It's a simple example of calculating marginal cost just by looking at the quantity you have of one particular good and the total cost associated with that good, and how those costs increase as you consume just one more unit of that good. So now we're going to calculate the marginal cost of an additional TV. And remember, the marginal cost is the additional cost incurred by increasing 1 unit of this particular good, in this case a TV. So as we can see, if it's 0 TVs, there's 0 total cost, so they're non-existent marginal cost. We have 1 TV that has a total cost of $225. So this is just $225 because there's only 1 TV, so the cost of 1 TV is $225. So now as we move up, we want 2 TVs. The total cost associated with 2 TVs is $600. So now what's our marginal cost? Well, our marginal cost is the additional cost associated with 1 more TV. So as we move from 1 to 2 TVs, the cost increased from $225 to $600. So to calculate our marginal cost, what we're doing is taking the difference between $600 and $225 to look at what the additional cost is. And in this case, 600 minus $225 is $375. So the total cost for 2 TVs is $600, but the marginal cost is $375 because that marginal cost is increasing from 1 TV to 2. So now, what is our marginal cost associated with 3 TVs? For 3 TVs, we have a total cost of $900. Whereas when we had 2 TVs, there was a total cost of $600. So as we increase from 2 to 3, which is a 1 unit increase in TVs, we've increased by $300. So that is our marginal cost. And we use the same concept to complete the board. So as we increase from 3 to 4 TVs, $240 because we've increased from $900 to $1,140. As we go from 4 to 5 TVs, our marginal cost is $225 because we've increased total cost from $1,140 to $1,365. And as we go from 5 to 6 TVs, what we have is we start to see a decrease in the total cost because as the volume increases, the total cost is decreasing because we have a greater volume of TVs. And so from $1,365 to $1,350, our marginal cost is now negative. It's a negative $15. In your course this fall, you'll be using this quite often when we get to the section dealing with producers, mainly calculating their marginal cost for production as well as their average cost for production, which average cost would be simply taking the average of the total cost to the number of TVs. So for example, if we wanted to take the average cost of 2 TVs, then we would take the total cost of $600 divided by 2, so the average cost would be $300. But essentially I just want to go over this example of marginal cost because you'll be seeing that a lot more frequently in the course this fall. So Consumer theory is what we're going to discuss next. It is very important to understand consumer theory in microeconomics. The consumer's objective is to always maximize their utility or their satisfaction. And there are 4 key preference assumptions associated with the consumer that are necessary for this consumer to basically maximize their utility. And those 4 preferences are completeness, transitivity, non-satiation, and strict convexity. Completeness. This one essentially states that the consumer can always compare and rank any 2 choices that they have. Transitivity. This just means the consumer can always order those choices in terms of their preferences. So for example, if I have CDs, DVDs, and books, if the consumer prefers CDs to DVDs and they prefer DVDs to books, then just by the natural order of things, they would prefer CDs to books. This is transitivity. Non-satiation. This is more is preferred to less, which just means the consumer always would want more than less of any particular good, and this is a key assumption in microeconomic theory. And for strict convexity, this just means that averages are preferred to extremes. So a consumer would rather have the average of any 2 goods rather than have an extreme where they have all of one good and nothing of the other one. So again, the 4 preference assumptions that are necessary for utility maximization are completeness, transitivity, non-satiation, and strict convexity. So in microeconomics, when we talk about consumer theory, the first things that you'll be looking at are indifference curves. Indifference curves basically represent all of those different bundles of goods and services that we talked about that are desirable for a consumer. And for the indifference curves, once you sketch those curves, they represent the combination of 2 goods that generate a given level of utility or satisfaction. And as you can see in example 3, I've drawn an indifference curve that represents what the consumer prefers in terms of DVDs and CDs. Now, one thing to keep in mind, we talked about marginal analysis just prior to this session. Marginal rate of substitution, it basically measures the slope of the indifference curve, and it's the rate at which the consumer is willing to trade any one good for another one. So in this example, we're looking at how the consumer is willing to trade off CDs to DVDs. For example, we have CDs at 8 quantity of CDs and then at 4, and then we have DVDs at 2 units of DVDs and at 4. So our marginal rate of substitution would be the ratio of CDs to DVDs that the consumer is willing to trade off. So what we can do is write this as the change in CDs over the change in DVDs. Or you would see if this CDs were good X2 and DVDs were good X1, a lot of times in microeconomics you will see it written as the marginal rate of substitution is equal to the negative X2 over X1. Okay? So in this particular example, what is our marginal rate of substitution? Can I go over this? Are you going to cut me out talking and say, can I go over to the next slide? Okay. So our marginal rate of substitution in this example will be equal to the negative 4 over 2, because what we have, the change in CDs drops from 8 to 4, which is negative 4. The change in DVDs goes from 2 to 4, which is a positive 2. So our marginal rate of substitution is negative 4 over 2, which is a negative 2. So in this example, the consumer is willing to give up 2 CDs to just gain 1 more DVD. Another key concept in consumer theory that you'll be introduced to are budget lines, or the budget of a consumer. How much a consumer is able to expend on any goods and services based on their budget. And so we have good X1, which are my CDs, good X2, which are my DVDs. P1 is the price associated with good X1, or the price of CDs is $15. P2 is the price associated with good X2, which is DVDs. So the price of DVDs is $60. These are some really expensive DVDs. And I is income, and income is equal to $300. So in this example, suppose you have an income of $300 and you want to spend all of your money on CDs and DVDs. At a price of $15 for CDs and a price of $60 for DVDs, if you exhausted all of your income on CDs, how many CDs would you be able to purchase at a price of $15? You would be able to purchase or consume 15 CDs, because what you're looking at is you're dividing your income, $300, divided by the price of CDs, $15, and this is 15. So you would be able to expend all of your money and purchase 15 CDs if you wanted to spend all of your income on CDs. If you wanted to spend all of your income on DVDs, we would use the same formula, 300 divided by the $60 for DVDs. So you would be able to purchase 5 DVDs if you expended all of your income on DVDs. So in your course, you'll be asked to sketch various budget lines based on the consumer's income and the price associated with 2 goods that they would like to purchase. And in order to sketch that, we would take the values that we got from calculating the quantity of CDs you would be able to purchase and the quantity of DVDs you would be able to purchase, and we would sketch our budget line. So X2 is DVDs, you'll be able to purchase 5 of those. X1 are CDs, you'll be able to purchase 15 of those, and you would just sketch a budget line, which would be a line like that. Now, the law of demand is one of my favorite things to discuss, because basically the law of demand just states that consumers buy more of a good when the price decreases and less when the price increases. And when you think about your purchasing behavior, this is a rational thing for consumers to do. The definition of demand is the quantity demanded of a good that consumers are willing to buy at a particular price. This is what we talk about when we talk about demand. It's just the quantity demanded of a good that consumers are willing to buy at a particular price. The change in demand versus the change in quantity demanded is something that you're going to become very familiar with in your course. So what I'm going to talk about are the things that actually shift the demand curve or cause a change in demand versus those things that only cause a movement along the demand curve, which is a change in quantity demanded. So there are 5 key things that would actually shift the demand curve, which is a change in the demand. When you have a change in your income, when there's a change in some type of preference in the market, taste or fashion, different things like that, when there's a change in the prices of other goods, which would be other substitute goods, when there's some type of population size and composition change within any particular market, or if there's a change in the geographical situation of buyers. So these are just random things that I'll point out that would actually cause a change in demand or a shift of the total demand curve, as opposed to just movement along that demand curve. Now, there's only one thing that will cause movement along the demand curve, and that's the actual change in the price of that good. So what I'm going to do is sketch a few examples of changes in demand and changes in quantity demand, and then explain why those curves are shifting. So in this particular example in the top, what I'm going to do is sketch supply and demand curves, just random supply and demand curves. Our demand curves would always be downward sloping, and our supply curves would always be upward sloping. So this is a supply and demand curve. This particular point in the middle where they intersect is the equilibrium point. And as we discussed equilibrium earlier in example 1, when you're faced with a problem in class, likely you would have to find equilibrium by looking at the supply and demand functions. But in this case, we're just sketching graphs. Consider in this example that there's a decrease in the price of beef. What would actually happen to consumer demand for chicken? Consider that chicken and beef would be substitute goods, so people eat chicken or beef. And so what would happen to the demand for chicken because there's a price increase in beef? In this case, we have the decrease in the price of beef, which is a substitute for chicken. So according to the law of demand, people would purchase less chicken because now they can purchase beef. So our demand curves, we have the first demand curve here, the second one is here. So it looks like our demand has decreased. This represents a shift in the total demand curve because the price of a substitute good has actually changed. In this example, the supply curve has stayed the same, but the demand curves have actually changed, creating a new equilibrium point here. So this represents a change in demand because it's a complete shift in the demand curve. In this next example, consider we're looking at the production of TVs. Say, for instance, a new type of technology cuts the production cost for making TVs. So let's sketch our demand curve again, and let's sketch our supply curve. Now, what would happen if a new type of technology actually cut the production of for making TVs? Well, this technology cuts the cost for making TVs, so this reduces the cost for suppliers of TVs. So we're looking at what's going to happen with our supply curve. So if this is our first supply curve, and now it costs less to make TVs, our second supply curve will shift out. And so this represents a change in supply, but what happened to the demand curve? The demand curve did not change at all. There was a shift along the demand curve from this point to this new point. So this bottom portion represents a change in quantity demanded, but a change in supply, and the top graph represents a change in demand and a change in quantity supplied. So let's go back to our top graph with chicken, where we see we have a change in demand. This was our original equilibrium point. So this represents quantity here and a price here. Now, what happened to our price and quantity when the demand curve changed? Because the demand curve changed, we now have a new value of quantity here. We'll call it Q2. And our price is here. We'll call that P2. So because we had a change in demand of chicken, the quantity of chicken decreased, because if we're using a scale with 0 to some number and 0 to some number here, our quantity decreased when the demand changed, and our price also decreased when the demand changed. So this is one way to look at what happens to price and quantity when your demand and supply curves change. Now if we look at TVs, we'll do the same thing. This was our original equilibrium point where supply and demand intersected. And we'll call this Q1 and P1, or price 1 and quantity 1. So when our supply curve changed, there was movement along the demand curve to a new equilibrium point here. We'll call that quantity 2, and we'll call that price 2. So what happened to quantity and what happened to price? The price goes down because the production cost for TVs actually decreased. So this makes sense. The price of TVs goes down, but the quantity of TVs goes up. So producers are able to produce more TVs at a lower cost, which means that lower cost has been passed on to the consumer in terms of a lower price that they pay for TVs. Consumer surplus. This is the final point that I want to talk about to introduce you to some of those things you'll be faced with in Public Affairs 830. Consumer surplus is defined as the difference between the price consumers are willing to pay and the actual price that they pay. So if someone is willing to pay more than the actual price, they benefit by being able to save when they didn't have to pay that price. For example, a person is willing to pay a tremendous amount for water since he needs it to survive. However, since there are competing suppliers of water, he is able to purchase it for less than he is willing to pay. This difference between those two prices is the consumer surplus. Suppose that, say I want to go to the movies. My demand for tickets is given as P equals 10 minus 2Q. And in class, your demand will always be given. So this is my demand for tickets. Now the admission price for the ticket is $2, which is a really cheap movie. So what is my consumer surplus? In order to calculate that, we would first look at my demand function and sketch that demand on the graph. In order to begin sketching the demand function, you first have to find the intercept for price and quantity and sketch that on the graph. And in order to find the intercept, we would have to set one side of the equation equal to 0 to get the value on the other side, and vice versa. So if price is 0, then what is Q? So what we do is move 2Q onto the one side of the equation and get it positive, equal to 10. So Q equals 5. So this is our intercept for quantity, 5. We would do the same thing to find our intercept for price. This time we will set Q equal to 0. So P equals 10 minus 2, and the value of Q is 0. So then P is equal to 10 minus 0, which is 10. So what I've essentially done is get the intercepts for price and quantity to begin sketching your demand function. There. So this is your demand function. So now that we have your demand function sketched on the graph, what we're going to look at is what you're willing to pay for one ticket according to your demand function. So price equals 10 minus 2, and if you only wanted one ticket, how much are you willing to pay? 10 minus 2, which is $8. So you're willing to pay $8 for a ticket, which we'll say 8 is right here, but the ticket price is only $2. So we'll say you're right here on the graph, but the ticket price is $2, which has you out here on the graph. So since you're willing to pay $8 for one ticket and the actual price of the ticket is $2, what is your consumer surplus? This area right here is your consumer surplus. And because this example is a simple example, you don't need an elaborate equation to calculate the consumer surplus. The consumer surplus would just be the difference between the $8 you're willing to pay and the $2 you actually have to pay. So your consumer surplus is equal to 8 minus 2, which is 6. And this is a very simple consumer surplus problem. Now I'll do another problem which actually has you using a little bit more of an equation to calculate. In this problem, we have my demand for apples given as P equal 4 minus Q over 2. And the price of apples has increased from $1 to $2 per bundle. So now we have to find out what would be my change in consumer surplus from the price increase of $1 to $2 for a bundle of apples. So the first thing we're going to do again is sketch my demand function on the graph by finding the intercepts. So we set price equal to 0. We're going to find the intercept on quantity. So Q over 2, because we moved it from the right side to the left side of the equation, equals 4. So now my quantity equals 8. So my intercept will be 8. So now, to find the intercept for price, we're setting the value of Q equal to 0. So then P would just be equal to 4. And let's put that right there. So my demand function sketched on this graph would be like this. Okay. Now, what we have to do is find the quantity associated with the oranges at the apples at the original price of $1. So at a price of $1, what quantity of apples would I purchase? So if the price is $1, then Q over 2 would be equal to 4 minus 1 equal 3, so Q equals 6. So at a price of $1, I would purchase 6 bundles of apples. Okay. Now that the price has increased to $2, we have to find out what quantity of apples I would purchase at $2. So $2, so Q over 2 equal to 4 minus 2. So that's 4. So that's somewhere here. And that's at $2. So now what we have to do is find my change in consumer surplus. My change in consumer surplus will be found by calculating this area here as the price increased from $1 to $2. So my consumer surplus will be calculating this area of the rectangle here between the price increase of $1 to $2 and this area of a triangle here between the price increase of $1 and $2 and a quantity decrease of 6 and 4. So my consumer surplus would be first this area of a rectangle, which would be, and if you remember the equation for calculating rectangle area, it's the length times the width. So what we're looking at is the length times the width of this area right here. So we would look at the length, 4 minus 0, multiplied by the width, 2 minus 1. Plus this area here, which is a triangle. And if you remember your equations for calculating the area of a triangle, is 1/2 the base times the height. So we would go 1/2 the base, which is 6 minus 4. Right here is the base. And the height, which is 2 minus 1. So our consumer surplus here is the area of a rectangle plus the area of a triangle, reflecting the difference between a $1 increase in the price of a bundle of apples to $2 and a 2-unit decrease in the quantity of apples consumed from 6 bundles to 4 bundles. So if we calculate this out, our consumer surplus is equal to 4 minus 0, which is 4, times 2 minus 1, which is 1, plus 1/2 of 6 minus 4, which is 2, times 2 minus 1, which is 1. So our consumer surplus is equal to 4 plus 1/2 of 2, which is equal to 4 plus 1, which is 5. So that change in our consumer surplus is a value of 5. And that's a little bit more complex, slightly more complex than the previous problem before. But this is essentially how you would be calculating consumer surplus. So essentially in this refresher course today, I've introduced you to a few basic concepts in microeconomic theory that should be helpful for you as you approach this autumn quarter in Public Affairs 830. I've discussed the role of the market and showed you how you would look at the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded, equate those equations together to get a market equilibrium price and quantity that all the consumers and producers in the market are satisfied with. And that was in our example 1. 2, I've looked at marginal analysis and introduced you to those concepts. Marginal analysis, again, looks at how you can compare alternatives incrementally. And so we have various terms that you should be familiar with: marginal cost, or the additional cost incurred from an additional unit consumed of a product; the marginal benefit, or the additional benefit you gain from basically consuming or producing one more unit of some product; the marginal utility, which is the additional utility that consumers gain when they consume an additional product. And in our example, we calculated our marginal cost of TVs by looking at the total cost of TVs and looking at the 1 unit increase in the amount of TVs that we purchased, and looking at the additional cost for each 1 unit of TVs that we purchased. 3, we've talked about consumer theory. Key points in consumer theory: indifference curves, the preferences of consumers that shape those indifference curves, meaning those consumers always prefer more to less. They can always compare and rank any 2 choices that they're given. They can always compare any 2 choices that they're given, and that averages are preferred to extremes. And that leads us to these indifference curves that are upward sloping indifference curves. I've also discussed the budget line. The budget line just represents all of the possible combinations of any 2 goods that exhaust your income. So if you have an income of $300 and 2 goods at the various prices of those 2 goods, your budget line would be sketched to show how much of each good you would be able to purchase if you exhausted your entire income on that particular good. And we also looked at the law of demand. The law of demand just basically says that consumers buy more of a good when its price decreases and less when its price increases. And we looked at how your demand curve can shift entirely, or you can just have movement along that demand curve depending on what happens in the marketplace. And finally, we looked at consumer surplus. And your consumer surplus, again, is just the difference between what the consumer is willing to pay and what they actually have to pay. And you can calculate that by simply looking at the difference in price, or you can calculate the change in their consumer surplus by looking at what happens to their surplus when prices increase or decrease. So I'm hoping that these 6 concepts that I've gone over today will be extremely helpful for you as you enter into your microeconomics class in the autumn quarter. Thank you.